Now joining me is Cora True-Frost, Associate Professor of Law at Syracuse University. Professor, we have seen those anniversaries taking place 25 years on as we reflect on this horrible tragedy. What are the lessons that can be learned, that must be learned today?
Well, thank you. The chief lesson that I think we as Americans can learn, and actually many countries around the world can learn, is the power of words. One of the most notable findings of the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, that's the criminal tribunal that was established by the United Nations Security Council in the wake of this horrific genocide, was that there were 3 journalists who were put on trial for disseminating and organizing the hatred that fomented that 100 days of death. And I think in a time of divisive politics, when politicians often speak to the lowest common denominator, it behooves all people in the world to think carefully about the message that they are receiving from their politicians and to question and to continue to remember our shared humanity and to check any attempt to characterize other groups as something less than human, which is what happened during the Rwandan genocide.
Professor True-Frost, can we go back a little bit and can you give us a bit of history especially to those viewers not super familiar with this incident? What event triggered this civil war, and why was it more brutal than many other civil wars in recent memory?
Well, as to the first question, President Habyarimana's plane was shot down at the beginning of April, and the day after that plane was shot down and the news was broadcast by some of the stations that were run by the journalists I mentioned, people began to establish checkpoints and to seek out Tutsis and to try to identify by their identity cards whether people were Tutsi and to simply exterminate them as though they were cockroaches or rats. But to pinpoint the plane crash is oversimplistic because there had been a kind of push and pull between the Hutus and the Tutsis for many years, especially since the Belgians had settled Rwanda. They were the first to issue the identity cards labeling Hutus and Tutsis, and to create this sense of difference in a people who otherwise share a religion and share a language, and for whom there may not have been such a difference. But the Belgians favored the Tutsis and gave them high-ranking positions and created a kind of social class that ended up in the genocide that we saw. In terms of the question, why was this particular atrocity more brutal than others, I hesitate to characterize it as such. I have worked in international criminal tribunals in Sierra Leone and in East Timor, and unfortunately, looking at Cambodia, for example, and many other atrocities, there are multiple occasions when humanity can show this type of brutality, and it's not unique to Rwanda. However, the 800,000 people dead does it sort of begs understanding to comprehend how so many people could have died. And the answer, I think, is that what would normally be an extraordinary crime, the crime of murder, became ordinary, in part because people were desensitized and political grievances were high, and there was a possibility of redistribution of power that was imminent and threatening to many people, and they allowed themselves to be led by leaders who were particularly intent on power.
Cora True-Frost, Associate Professor of Law at Syracuse University, thank you so much for your insight.